Actually, I'm moderating the next session. Will be my research assistant and really, I think, the brain trust behind this exhibition. Rhiannon Knol, who did her master's in classics at UCLA, and second you see classical Greek and Latin on someone's resume, you hire them right away. So I'd like to have Rhiannon introduce these afternoon speakers, and I just want to say what a great pleasure it's been to work on this show with you. I think I said it last night, I couldn't have done it without you, and I still mean it. So, okay, Rhiannon Knol, thank you.
Hello, and thanks, David, for answering the age-old question, who introduces the introducer? So I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Karin Leonhard. She's the professor of art history at Konstanz University, Germany, with a focus on Dutch and British art history and theory. Before, she was professor of art history at Bonn University, a senior fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, as a member of the research group Art and Knowledge in Pre-Modern Europe, and also an assistant professor at the Department of Art History, KU Eichstätt-Ingolstadt, Germany, where she returned after a 2-year fellowship at the Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence. She received her doctorate in Munich with a dissertation on optics and perspective in Vermeer's interior paintings, and since then, she has specialized in the history of science and art of the early modern period. A main focus of her research lies in the history and theory of space and perspective and of light and color. She has studied the history of concepts of creativity and more generally the interrelationship between art history and natural philosophy. It's within this framework that she's completed her habilitation on the concept of the Bildfeld or Campo in 17th century nature pieces and still life paintings. One of her most recent articles is entitled Pictura's Fertile Field, Otto Marcius van Schreik and the Genre of Sottobosco Painting, and another study called Painted Poison, Venomous Beasts, Herbs, Gems, and Baroque Color Theory has appeared recently as well. And so I'm happy to introduce her to speak to you, her talk with the elegant title, Still Lifes, Transient Lives.
You're going to do that. So, thank you for the invitation, the kind introduction, and the PowerPoint is going to be. So, this paper is about the idea of transience and metamorphosis in Baroque still life painting, particularly in the work of Johannes Goudas. Goudas is remembered both as a painter whose subjects were mainly flower still lifes with birds and insects, and as one of the earliest authors on entomology. He was the first to write on the insects of the Netherlands, and more important, he was the first to base his discussions entirely on first-hand observation. So he was working on a book on the metamorphosis of insects. It is less known, however, that Goudas was also an alchemist. He had considerable knowledge of chemistry and pharmacy, and reportedly knew how to make antimony. He will be the central figure in my talk. And as the time frame will not allow to expand on it, I can only hint at the idea that already in very early still life painting, as it was developed in the cities of Prague, of Antwerp and Utrecht at the very beginning of the 17th century, by Abraham Bossart, by Jan Bruegel the Elder, by Georg Flegel and others, we find alchemical notions that turn the genre of still life into a realm of potentiality, transformation and enlivenment. In July 1663, Balthasar de Montcogny, a man with an interest in art and the natural sciences, met with the painter and entomologist Johannes Goudas. This meeting took place after several unsuccessful attempts. At first, when Goudas was not home, his close friend and publisher, Jacob Ferencz, entertained the traveler and showed him the original book by Goudas. The book referred to here is the manuscript of the first volume of his aforementioned Metamorphoses. Soon after, Montcogny finally had the opportunity to meet Goudas in person. The following note is written in his diary, and we are really lucky to have this diary as the only source concerning the art of Goudas. And I quote, "First, when I went to see Mr. Ferenc, who led me to the home of the painter Goudas, from whom I learned how to prepare antimony." Further, Monconi writes, he's a very skilled painter of landscapes, insects, and flowers. And even Laurens Boll, who in the 1970s rediscovered Goudas for art history as a good unknown, as he calls him, no longer quoted this passage. So he just took the first sentence and left out the part which I'm interested in now, because this passage is followed by a much longer section, which shows Goudas as a true alchemist. And I quote again from Monconi's diary. He, so that is Goudas, is a chemist and knows how to extract the emetic faculty from the antimony. And by using a powder which he melts in a crucible, upon inserting a piece of iron, like the blade of a sword, it is herein rendered as soft as butter. End of quote. To Monconi, Goudas' combined fields of activity, comprised of painting, of entomology, and of alchemy, did not seem unusual. They soon began discussing the theory of spontaneous generation, to which Goudas adhered, and his, and I quote again, experiments on insects, which he showed me in his book, which he soon plans to publish. Here he is again referring to a passage in Goudas' entomological work, The Metamorphosis, dedicated to the change in color, the pupation, and the transformation of insects. Above all, however, Monconi notes several recipes for the production of alchemical pharmakeia, readily given to him by Goudas. One of the first was for the production of tartar emetic, and I will quote in full length because it is a rather interesting recipe, and as I said before, it's not really known in research literature. So here it is. So the recipe is as follows. You take 1 pound of antimony and 1 pound saltpeter, pulverize perfectly and mix together, and having placed a crucible over a fire, when it glows very red, add 1 spoonful of the powder after the other to it, covering the crucible each time with a clay brick until it is entirely decocted. Then, when this has happened, cover the crucible with glowing embers and allow these to burn down completely and leave the crucible to cool without touching it. Then pulverize what is in the crucible and dump this powder into hot water. After this, filter it, and reserving the water, take that which could not pass through, dry it, and pulverize it, and mix it anew with as much saltpeter as its own weight, and repeat this operation a total of 3 times. And this is the manner in which antimony is prepared, to which we must add cream of tartar and scammony, which is prepared as follows. Pulverize perfectly, then place it in an iron bowl, pour spirits of wine on it to extract the tincture from it entirely. When nothing more can be extracted, allow your saturated spirits of wine to evaporate over a small flame by half, then add fresh water to it, and in this way the scammony precipitates into a nice gum. The dose is 20 grams of antimony, 30 grams scammony, and 10 of cream of tartar. If you add a small amount of wine vinegar to the water in which you melted the antimony after it has burned, it will precipitate into a white powder, which, washed in rose water or even plain water, until it no longer has any taste, is an excellent diaphoretic. Taken 2 grams of it, 15 grams buckthorn, and 10 of wormwood salt with some theriaca. End of quote. So it's rather complex, and I'm also curious if this would work. I have no idea. The result of this complex process is a pharmacon used to purify the body. Carefully dosed, its function is a laxative, an emetic, and a diaphoretic agent. Among physicians with iatrochemical interest, it was considered a panacea, so that is a life-prolonging medicine. Purified tartar was referred to as crème de tartare, which when added to the mildly toxic scammony, the root of the scammony, I think, a flower which is historically referred to as purging bindweed, produced a remedy considered to be first class. To this, antimony was added, a lustrous grey metalloid, known in English as antimony glans. According to the old alchemists, its effect was similar to that of a coagulated mercury, in its silvery grey appearance to that of lead. For this reason, antimony in the alchemical process was thought to symbolize the earthly principle. According to subsequent definitions, the name is derived from the Latin form of the Greek antimonion, which means it's fully bloomed. And so we can already note the many references in alchemical language to flowers, their blossoming, their blooming, and also their decaying. In the alchemical process, its addition caused an oxidation process which had to be repeated multiple times so that, while it was smoldering, the initial sulfur compound could convert into an oxygen compound when exposed to air. Then, when combined with tartaric acid, it could develop into tartar emetic. In any case, antimony was considered a precious starting element for alchemical transformation. And the tartarus emeticus, or the tartar emetic, the white powdery substance that could be derived from it, a wonderful universal medicine expected to render all other medicines obsolete. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the internal use of antimony compounds introduced by Paracelsus was actually very controversial, and in France was even officially banned in the 17th and 18th centuries. This led to heated arguments between iatrochemists and Galenic physicians, and is perhaps one reason why Monconi specifically noted that Goudas had taught him to prepare antimony, and I quote, in such a way as not to cause vomiting. It had already been used as a preparation in the healing arts of classical antiquity, specifically as a black eye salve and as an eye makeup, as well as for the external treatment of wounds and boils. Now, however, grey antimony, also known as antimonium crudum, was also ingested in the form of pills or added to drinks to treat melancholy and nausea. Antimony hepar, or the Crocus metallorum, or the liver of antimony, on the other hand, was the term used to refer to the brownish-yellow mixture of various antimony compounds derived from the deflagration of antimony mixed with saltpeter and its subsequent annealing. Washed with water, and Goudas even used rose water, it produced an important intermediate product for the preparation of the valuable substance tartar emetic, and could even be taken as a medicinal product itself. It is important to know that in alchemy, antimony and its compounds, due to their unusual characteristics, played an important role. Considerable importance was attached to its ability to alloy gold. Its medicinal effects were not least attributed to its gold refining properties. Particularly in the docimastic art, antimony sulfide was used to separate gold and silver. Here, a silver-gold alloy was repeatedly melted with antimonite, which caused a gold antimony alloy to collect at the bottom of the vessel, and the melted silver sulfide was poured off. Upon reheating the alloy, the antimony would burn away. What remained was pure gold. Its designation as the so-called iudex ultimus, or the last judge, therefore stems from its ability to separate gold and silver. Whereas we can see that a Christological aspect now comes into play as well. The ability of antimony to separate is seen as a metaphor for the Last Judgment, which precedes the ultimate transformation of physical bodies into immortal bodies in the resurrection. In the context of antimony compounds, Goudas apparently also shared with Monconi his recipe for another transformation, that is, to melt iron to achieve the so-called crocus martis stellatus. It was red in color, and I already show you the slide with a quotation, as the crocus martis was mainly composed of iron oxide. So I again will quote this recipe, which is now that you take 4 I didn't know this actually wasn't well to decipher, so well pulverized. Place it in a crucible to melt, and when it melts, one must add 2 spoonfuls of saltpeter, well pulverized, and mixing it all with a spatula, blow vigorously. And when it is all perfectly fused together, if one places into it a piece of iron, like the blade of a sword, it will melt like butter. He also told me the manner in which to melt gold in one's hand, placing a ducat in the shell of an egg or on the peel of an orange, and atop this put saltpeter and tartar, pulverizing each well and setting it on fire with an ember. Both Balthasar de Monconi and Johannes Goudas shared an interest in Paracelsian medicine. According to Paracelsus, all material things were created out of a universal seed, the so-called chaos sulphureus sale mercurialis. The potentialities therein were to be realized, and natural processes were to be artificially completed by the alchemist. In this way, so that is by completing natural processes or natural forms artificially, the alchemist resembled the artist, and conversely, the artist resembled the alchemist, for example, when he prepared his pigments by grinding or melting substances, which he was then transforming into art on the picture plane. As we have seen, antimony red, a fine, odorless and tasteless red-orange powder, could be made out of antimony and sulfur. It was used as a pigment, but what is even more interesting about these kinds of antimony compounds is their simultaneous use as a pharmaceutical preparation. Antimony red, for instance, was helpful in the treatment of catarrhal ailments. The Crocus metallorum was used as a powerful emetic. Grey antimony, administered in pill form, was, along with the crystallized Tartarus emeticus, one of the most widely known remedies of the late 16th and 17th centuries. Antimony glans was one of the most important minerals in spagyric medicine, that is, in the pharmaceutical application of alchemy. The different colors of antimony compounds that could vary between shades of black, gray, red, and yellow, on the other hand, represented different steps of the magnum opus. The alchemistic transmutatio of the elements resembled a path from dark to lights, or to the red tones of, for example, silver, or to the red tones of gold, depending on what was to be obtained through the transmutation of ennoble material, merely white elixirs or silver, or the more valuable gold. According to the Paracelsian model, this occurred over 7 gradations of color. The starting point was usually black, so the stage of nigredo, which was equated with an original state of matter or materia prima. After the process had gone through various stages of color, usually yellow, green, white, and then sort of iridescence, so-called peacock tail, its success was signaled by a red tinge, so rubedo. Here the color sequence, known since Greek alchemy as blackening, whitening, yellowing, and reddening, is taken up and further differentiated. The importance attached to the colors of the alchemical process become particularly apparent in the sophisticated color scheme of the symbolic representations of the various stages of the opus, as can be seen in this example of an alchemical manuscript illumination, and Jörg Völlnagel has already shown you other examples of this sort of stages of the opus, shown in a range of colors. The chromatic change could be followed through the transparent glass wall of a vase hermeticum, the hermetic vessel or flask. Goudas' alchemical art of separation and his still life paintings have some elements in common. Note the beautifully decorated flower vase, for example, in which the substances transform, they effloresce, and thereby change in color. Also the central position of the rose within the flower arrangement, but also the rather significant use of the colors red and white in the composition of the painting. In Hermetic vocabulary, the rose, known as the Flor Sapientiis, or the flower of wisdom, had always been considered especially significant. In illustrations of alchemical treatises, one can see how a rose changes color during the process of transmutation, or more specifically, how a white rose represents the queen and a red one the king, and a rose with variegated petals symbolizes the fusion of these two opposing principles. In alchemy, the dew, so in Latin rose, on the leaves, on the other hand, long served as a code name for the powdery substance of the cream of tartars, or the cremor tartari, which was created in the alchemical process. In the flowers in a Van Lee vase with blue tit, we also find withering leaves at the bottom of the bouquet, which correspond with the activity of the little bird that is picking apart a moth with its beak. Hereby, the color of the leaves changes from a brownish green to a yellow. And in the middle of the bouquet, next to the magnificent tulips, the head of a horned violet protrudes next to the head of an iris, very impressive one. Their yellow centers radiate out into a bluish-violet petal edge, giving them the appearance of a little flame. In the alchemical code language of the 17th century, the blue violet and the iris play an increasingly important role, namely to illustrate the vitality of minerals by analogy with living organisms such as plants. In A Still Life with a Grasshopper and a Snail, another still life by Goudas, he really painted only a view, the jagged petal form of an anemone is rendered in such a brilliant shade of red that once one has heard of Goudas' alchemical experiments, one is more than tempted to draw a connection between a striking color hue and a chemical pigment that was used to create the effect. And it hasn't been checked on the pigments. I would be so curious to know what was used. So the guess could be either be vermilion or maybe also sort of antimony red. And you can also look at the color range here from the center of it. So it's black, white, red, that it's supposedly connected to an alchemical notion behind that. So the goal of the process of transmutation, after all, is to transform less valuable substances into gold, or figuratively speaking, to purify impure matter. Alchemical thought is thus immediately linked to the idea of a possible activation, a liberation, and a resurrection of spiritual inclusions in matter, as well as with the desire of natural forms to constantly rejuvenate and renew themselves. Even the creatures added to the still lives, seem to be involved in the advancement and sublimation of substances from primordial matter to ethereal bodies. In our first still life, along with the blue tit, picking apart a moth, a shell, always a symbol of the telluric element, sits atop a massive stone plinth, while in the second still life, a snail takes its place, and a moth and a butterfly ascend into the upper half of the painting and or the air. Represented here is the gooseberry or magpie moth, now a rare moth with a striking pattern, described by Goudas in the first book of his Metamorphoses as, and I quote, white and very artfully flecked in black. And you can also see a red admiral over there, which he identifies in his book again in the second part as, and I quote, peacock-colored and pleasant to behold. And in both instances, it is moths and butterflies with characteristic black and white or red and black patterns, similar to the flamed flower petals, which appear in the painting in all variations. So I think I don't have to point out the significance of the colors black and red and white in alchemy again. So thinking of your scarf, David, I will call it the Admiral scarf, I think. So here we've got it in the painting. The Chinese vase itself, however, is the foundation and container of all the stages of the flowers blossoming, withering, and dying, of the distillates and substrates used for the painting itself. One is reminded of the experiments with glass vials conducted by famous alchemists such as Athanasius Kircher and Sir Kenelm Digby, who, parallel to a vivid 17th century discussion on palingenesis, attempted to revive dried plants and flowers, namely roses and also thistles, using iatrochemical methods. Or one is reminded of the illustrations in manuscripts about the art of alchemy and the magnum opus. Here, for example, in the second stage of transmutation, or the so-called whitings, or the albedo, a white flower juts out from the spadix, and in the reddening phase, in the rubedo phase, on the other hand, a red flower, and so on. In Goudas' still life with the grasshopper and snail, the Chinese vase is also decorated with a phoenix, which in Chinese mythology was thought to be one of the animals that helped the creator of the universe in his work. In its alchemical sense, the phoenix symbolized the last stage of the great work, the magnum opus. All of these motivic allusions would already suffice to interpret the still life as a place both of an artistic and an alchemical transformation. However, in writings and illustrations from the early modern era, the vase hermeticum itself is thought of as a phoenix egg, which remains after the bird burns in its nest. Out of it, a new phoenix, or the very same bird just rejuvenated, will emerge. In this way, the image field presents itself as the stage of a wonderful, regenerative force that runs through all stages and colors and draws new out of the old. As a result, the next semantic level of our painting immediately opens up, and Christological connections are established. This is because since the Middle Ages, the phoenix has been seen as having a sacrificial character and has been equated with the Holy Spirit or even with Christ, who sacrificed himself to bring about the resurrection. Golds and purples are the colors of the phoenix plumage, in which, and I quote, rose-colored feathers with a wonderful multitude of colors are mixed, end of quote. Like so often in early modern still lifes, the vase sits atop a plinth with visible chips in its surface, alluding to a different time span, one much longer than the brief lifespan of a flower, which only blossoms for a few days, or that of the even more ephemeral-seeming insects, which whiz, which fly and crawl, or like the garden snail in the bottom right corner of the painting, slowly but surely make their way out of the pictorial space. The blossoms are all streaked with fine veining and nuances of color, and are thereby specified, whereas the red and white striped cloak of the carnation, when one takes into account its repeated symbolic use in other still lifes from the 17th century, so carnation is always a hint of the Passion of Christ, cannot avoid overlapping Christological interpretive models. As we have seen, a moth descending toward the blossoms serves as the antithesis of the magnificent admiral, which tends upward and appears to suck nectar from the blossoms, while the grasshopper on the left and the bee in the center of the light-colored rose blossom, as well as the previously mentioned snail on the right, are not only cast as additional protagonists, but are placed deliberately and really quite carefully in each corner of the picture, as if Goudas wanted them in balance, in a sort of equilibrium, while the bee in the center gathers the honey, so the golden honey, from the rose stamina. Even the painted dewdrop, in its balance between flow and standstill, contributes to the concentrated tension in the painting. And you know that dew also means a rose in Latin. So Goudas' interest in the cycle of life between becoming and decaying is once again condensed in the motif of the Chinese porcelain vase. The phoenix depicted on it promises resurrection after the earthly life has ended. It is in this way that the theological, the alchemical, and also the biological aspects of Goudas' paintings merge in his still lifes, which are concerned with the renewal and the regeneration of life forms. It is also in this manner that his artistic and his scientific activities can be thought of as being linked together, as the pictorial space emerges as a space of metamorphosis and of regenerative forces. Thank you. I think we've got a lot of time left.
You can answer a lot of questions. Also, I should add, I forgot to mention this in your introduction, but before I met you, I knew of you because if any of you know David, you know that he owns a basilisk lizard. And a basilisk having a lot of alchemical symbolism, and I think he owns Zanji because of sort of your encouragement / insistence that because you picked out the store where you go to find one.
Yes, it's true. It's definitely true. And it all happened. That's how research, as a result of research. I was working on Sottobosco paintings, and you can see a lot of lizards in Sottobosco paintings. And then if you go into the alchemical context, you can see that the lizard is sort of code name also for quicksilver, I think, very often. So I started to become interested in lizards. And they materialized in a way.
Anyone have questions?
very much enjoyed it. Did you look into Hieronymus Bosch and some alchemical symbology in his works? Hieronymus Bosch?
Bosch, okay.
Yeah.
Not really, because the Bosch literature is huge and I didn't dare to go there, but definitely there's a tradition which is older, definitely. And if you look into the research on Dutch still life, that's exactly the problem. They don't really look into the earlier forms, be it with the iconography or just the structure of paintings, which prepared the still life painting as a genre. And in some way, when I started to work on, for example, Sottobosco painting, I was really confronted with this literature on still life painting, which was just about the beauty of the flowers and so on, but it was not about the context of it. And what is needed now in research is to place it into the contexts. So it would be really necessary to look into other different kinds of genres, but with another iconography linked to the still life painting iconography, but also to look into alchemical contexts, to really, broaden that, open it up, because otherwise it's just a still life painting. Everybody knows it's beautiful, but we don't have anything to say about still life paintings. But I think it has a lot to say about them.
I enjoyed your talk. I think it would be really useful for you to get some kind of technical study of the pigments. For one thing, what you were talking about with the brown leaves is actually a deterioration of the color.
Yes, yeah.
And the blue that leaves, and so it would have originally been much green.
Yeah, that's definitely a problem. Also, the other vase, which maybe is there. So also this is not a gold color on the vase. It should have been blue before. And again, this is just the alteration of the pigments. And it's always so difficult then to talk about color if you don't know about the history of the pigments themselves and how they have changed. So of course I tried to be in contact with restorers. But still, the leaves show a sort of deterioration. So they are withering. So you see that There is a change of color in the leaves indicated. But even if it's not as we see it now, as it was painted, you can say that it's not a very fresh leaf which is depicted at the bottom of the vase, and they become more and more perfect at the top of the bouquet. So it's sort of status of decaying matter.
Yeah, there's stages within the depiction of the
Yeah.
leaves, but it is really, a lot of it has to do with the changes in the
Yeah,
chemical
yeah.
changes, and it would be interesting you can examine it without doing any XRF and other techniques.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely one of my wishes. When I started working on Sottobosco, I was interested in the link between the material of the paintings and the iconography as well, because it was about poisonous mushrooms, and I wanted to know if the painter used poisonous, toxic pigments, and it was just so difficult to get information. It's by chance. Sometimes the painting was examined and it's wonderful, I've got the information, but most of the time it's not like this. And I was staying in Florence at that time, and it was not possible to get it, across the street to do the examinations. Mm-hmm. So that's always where art history and restoration should come together more closely. Here it happens, but sometimes it doesn't happen. It's really difficult to get information. Yeah, it's very important here.
It's like in these Accademia dei Lincei watercolors, or I guess Federico Chesi's, they belong to him. They're mostly Italian ones, and they're always showing flowers and sort of the state of blossom, different stages of blossom, but they're all shaped like alembics. It's almost like a chemical vessel opening up. So the vessel is the process itself. And I wonder if that shows up in Central, North European stuff. I always wondered whether there was something particularly associated with, like, Della Porta and people working with Della Porta, whether it was an Italian thing, or if you do see that in still lifes where the flower is represented as like an alchemical apparatus. So.
maybe, yeah. It's also the bulb of the tulip, for example, resembles that a lot, and the power coming out of that again. So, yeah. Yeah, I have to check on that because I focused more on the Dutch northern part, but of course I know about the scientific illustrations in Italy as well. So, yeah.
Should work on convincing David to get a dog. So next, our next speaker will be Matthew C. Hunter, who is an associate professor in the Department of Art History and Communication Studies at McGill University, and is currently this year an NEH fellow at the Huntington Library, so not just down the road, but pretty close. He researches art and architecture of the long 18th century with special attention to their intersections with science and technology. His publications include Wicked Intelligence, Visual Art and the Science of Experiment in Restoration, London, from University of Chicago Press in 2013, The Clever Object, Wiley, also 2013, it was a busy year, co-edited with Francesco Lucchini, and also Beyond Mimesis and Convention, Representation in Art and Science, with Roman Frigg. And he is also an editor of The Grey Room. So please welcome Matthew Hunter, who will talk about Rendered Immortal, the work of art in an age of chemical reproduction.
Thanks. In early January 1776, the London press relayed a striking story from Paris. Newspapers told how a native of Persia, a man of profound and continual meditation on all the different secrets of nature, unquote, had brought a shocking proposition to the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. This mysterious Persian doctor avowed that in 6 hours' time, he could make real living children, quote, without knowledge of women and by the art of chemistry alone. The French police and ultimately the royal court at Versailles caught word of these claims. Charged with providing evidence to support them, this doctor was sequestered in a room at Versailles, kept there under lock and key. He emerged after the appointed time. He presented to King Louis XVI, quote, a most beautiful male child with all the natural faculties that accompany children by the usual way. It differed in nothing from other infants, but the astonishing manner in which it had been produced. Now, while newspapers in London went on to warn British women lest men of the 1770s should also learn to, quote, reproduce themselves without their aid, that dream of chemical means for achieving human asexual replication was an old one. Key to the doctrine of the homunculus embraced by 16th century alchemist Paracelsus, but as we know, far older, the making of human life by chemical technique figures in the watercolor illuminated scroll associated with the name of George Ripley, which is on display in the GRI, an example of which. Indeed, a central claim of David's stunning show, or a reminder of David's stunning show, is that such aspirations were hardly peculiar to early modern Europeans. Instead, they should be seen as inseparable from a truly global traffic in materials, ideas, and techniques, connecting European adepts to makers in 15th century Ming China, as well as to far older currents. Yet, in 1770s London, the allure of the homunculus and the creation of chemical life had a weird gravitation to Sir Joshua Reynolds. First president of Britain's Royal Academy of Art from 1768, leading society painter, painter of more than 2,000 portraits, Reynolds was also an inveterate chemical experimentalist. Informed by technical experiments he had joined at the Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures, and Commerce from the mid-1750s, Reynolds introduced unusual media into his paintings. Beeswax, spermaceti extract, bitumen, triterpenoid resins. With these and other substances, Reynolds mixed pigments to paint his so-called self-portrait as a deaf man of 1775, now at Tate Britain. Experiments like these could also deliver audacious triumphs, such as Sarah Siddons's Tragic Muse, now at the Huntington Art Gallery. Their visual quotation of Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling and visualization of Aristotle's theory of tragic catharsis are realized in surfaces that seem to compress, to accelerate paint's material life in time. But those experiments could also flake, buckle, and fade. They could rupture pictorial integrity, as in this portrait of painter James Coutts, a painting donated to the fledgling National Gallery of Scotland in the 1850s, precisely as a means for teaching a moral lesson to aspiring artists about the dangers of Reynolds' risky techniques. And Reynolds documented these experiments. The Royal Academy in London now holds one of at least 10 canvases, such as this one, kept in Reynolds' studio, where trials of pigments, binders, and paint media were annotated, sometimes dated, and preserved for working reference. What you see here, you can see some of the surviving annotations which appear to have been written with nutgall ink that have then been effaced as the picture was subsequently, as the canvas was subsequently varnished. So they were highly legible in the 1840s when Charles Locke Eastlake made extensive transcriptions from them, but they're almost impossible to read now. Reynolds also encrypted his experimental program. In financial ledgers now at Cambridge's Fitzwilliam Museum, payments on his portraits listed alphabetically and chronologically in the book's fronts give way to iterative recipes for the paintings themselves, often encoded in a mix of Latin, Pidgin Italian, and English. What is more, Reynolds foregrounded the chrysopoetic ambition by which enlightened Europe had then recently come to define alchemy as such, per the influential argument of Bill Newman and Larry Principe. That is, Reynolds placed gold making at the very heart of academic art. Explaining in 1774 how artistic novelty could flow from the imitation of the old masters, the sixth installment of Reynolds' Discourses of Art adjures the aspiring painter to, quote, pick up from dunghills what by a nice chemistry passing through his own mind shall be converted into pure gold. As with the picture Joseph Wright of Derby had exhibited in 1771 as, quote, the alchemist in search of the philosopher's stone discovers phosphorus and prays for the successful conclusion of his operation, as was the custom of the ancient chemical astrologers, Reynolds' nice chemistry was both a matter of rational science and happy accident. Making innovative art, that is, would unfold through steady steps of the alchemist's defining transmutation, but invention also happens through that combination of accident and sagacity to which critic Horace Walpole had then recently given the name serendipity. Serendipity, forged from Walpole's reading of Persian fairy tales, brings us back to the Persian Doctor of 1776. In that light, it is especially interesting to note that Reynolds had already begun concentrating his strangest chemical experiments into images of children in the early 1770s. Between 1771 and 73, the painter scheduled more than 150 sessions with child models as he built a body of so-called fancy pictures, where portrayal of specific individuals could seed to imaginative play. With its conspicuous reference to Caravaggio, Reynolds' double portrait of Henry and Charlotte Spencer, now two at the Huntington, is as much a species of such fancy as it is a foray into the technical unknown. Quote, first olio, a poi colori con cera senza olio. So Reynolds claims of this picture in the back of his Fitzwilliam ledgers. Reading such notes as they detail skins painted first in oil, followed by a second campaign forged from pigments bound in wax alone, has long troubled picture conservators. So one wrote to the Huntington in 2001, quote, do you have any evidence that this is indeed the case, and if so, how the painting has survived consequently? But the most curious meditation on Reynolds' evolving experiments with chemicals that, like the alchemical homunculus, took on lives of their own is surely a painting exhibited at the Royal Academy some 6 months after Reynolds' alchemical Discourse 6 was read. Nathaniel Hone's pictorial conjurer displaying the whole art of optical deception, seen here, shows a would-be conjurer directing a wand to a site of combustion at extreme lower left. There, fire leaps forth, consuming a cascade of copperplate prints after old master pictures. Accepted into the exhibition, Hone's picture was promptly rejected once identified as a satire of Reynolds himself. The principal figure, wrote one contemporary, was supposed to be a wizard who had discovered by his skill in the black arts proof of Sir Joshua's plagiarism. Plagiarism here meaning that very borrowing and recombination from the old masters that Reynolds had just theorized in alchemical terms. While Hone's picture would gather a rich period discussion about the value, the durability, the propriety of an art like Reynolds's that took the alchemists' transmutations of base materials as their organizing drive, the tale of the Persian doctor calls our attention away from the hirsute conjurer toward the young child folded into his lap. What if this child were to be understood not simply as a deluded student, a kind of polychrome echo to the diminutive babe we see in the open leaf of the page that the adept turns, but instead as a living product of his chemical making? What if, in short, this child is not simply a being grown from the biological embryos depicted by Gautier d'Agoty in a volume included in David's show, but is taken as a chemical homunculus worthy of the Persian doctor himself? Now, unlike Victor Frankenstein's reading in the corpus of Agrippa, Albertus Magnus, and Paracelsus, we know very little about Joshua Reynolds' library or his familiarity with alchemical sources per se. In turn, the focus of my paper this afternoon is not Reynolds exactly, but a host of artists and chemists who claim to bear his project into the future, and to do so during the tumultuous revolutionary decade after Reynolds' death in 1792. Beginning with Benjamin West, who followed Reynolds as the Royal Academy's second president, I survey as much the generation of artists who would inherit a technical landscape remade in Reynolds' influential image as a sampling of the entrepreneurs, figures such as Joseph Booth and the Soho manufactory of Matthew Boulton and James Watt, who would sell in chemical terms a material stability Reynolds had eschewed from art in the grand manner. Like the Reynolds replicating enamel painter William Russell Birch, the figures I want to highlight might be seen as practitioners in chemical arts of life's prolongation, a concern itself central to the alchemical tradition, as Gerald Grumman and others have so convincingly shown. Through their delicacy of chemical practice, these practitioners would provide for Reynoldsian picture making, what Birch called a unique art of heightening and preserving the beauty of tints to futurity without a possibility of their changing, unquote. And focusing less on any originary maker of chemical homunculi, a la Mary Shelley's Victor Frankenstein, than those who would, as it were, manage and sustain chemically generated life, a huge organizing trouble to the plot of Frankenstein, as we all know, I mean to reconsider familiar stories told about the meeting of art in the long 18th century. Certainly, as any viewer of David's show will attest, the connections between alchemy and the visual arts are legion, nowhere more so than the alchemical stills and distillations by which Jan van Eyck had mythically forged oil as a painting medium. But if historians of Enlightenment art have had much to say to historians of chemistry, those conversations might well be emblematized by the double portrait of chemist Antoine Laurent Lavoisier and his wife and illustrator Marie-Anne Pierrette-Pauls, painted in 1788 by no less a beacon of modernism than Jacques-Louis David. The story I want to tell is messier. just as it draws upon a recent historiography of science that has complicated tales of an 18th century chemical revolution with Lavoisier as its hero, so it tracks an experimental legacy upward and beyond the dark wood of what was once called British neoclassical and romantic painting. I mean to get at that darkness through a concluding gesture to Thomas Wedgwood, a figure whose work troubles as much the eternal chemical futurity makers like Birch sought to secure as the stability of the stories we tell about the arts now known as photography. With darkened palm and shaded foot held aloft, Benjamin West's Angel of the Resurrection stares directly out from the picture plane. Split down the spine of the image through his unevenly forked locks, West's angel figures a struggle for balance, a pursuit of equilibrium between the resplendent plumage of a proper left wing and its obscured twin at right. Light and dark, sprouting life versus curling smoke, the image's various efforts at left-right reconciliation call attention to the massive boulder on which the angel sits. Although its rough hatchings recall the graphic vocabulary of woodcut, West is indeed a chemical image. Dated to 1801, published in Philippe André's Specimens of Polyautography of 1803 to 1807, an extremely rare collection which we have here at the GRI that through David's generosity I was able to study at some length earlier, or I should say 6 months ago now. This print is an early example of l'imprimerie chimique, or lithography, invented by entrepreneurial printer Alois Felder between 1796 and 1798. According to Walter Benjamin, in the famous essay to which my title gives a nod, the advent of lithography marked a key contribution to the technological acceleration of the image in the modern age. Quote, the fact that the drawing is traced on stone rather than incised on a block or etched on a copper plate, Benjamin had observed, made it possible for graphic art to market its products not only in larger numbers, but in daily changing forms. Yet for Senna Felder, lithography was more than Benjamin's Technischen Reproducierbarkeit. It counted as an innovation precisely because it was based, quote, not on mechanical, but on purely chemical properties. Explaining the oil-water resist at the base of his technique, Senna Felder stressed how his preferred Solnhofer limestone possessed affinity for fat which is absorbed so deeply that in many cases, even extensive grinding will not remove it. Sinking a greasy ink design into wet stone and allowing it to be set aside for a day that it may take good hold of the stone, the lithographic artist then coats the stone with acid, gum arabic, and lithothene, rendering the design invisible. Left immured in stone, the design becomes positively Christological, or so West's print would have us see, for alternately inked and watered, attracting the positive unctuous forms already encased in stone with the renewed application of fatty printer's ink, while resisting the untreated areas which will read as negative, the stone is rolled and rocked under the press to reveal the design resurrected on the paper lifted off from it. He is not here, for he is risen. So reads West's quotation from Matthew 28:6 at the base of the print, concisely allegorizing lithography's chemical action. Now, West's speedy attraction to the practice and the poetics of chemical printing is interesting. For in the last years of the 1790s, he had been at the center of a scandal surrounding the purported reclamation of Titian's chemical knowledge, an episode known as the Venetian Secret. Late in 1795, the father-daughter team of Thomas and Anne Jemima Provis had approached West. They claimed to possess a manuscript detailing lost techniques used by 16th century Venetian painters to produce their celebrated chromatic effects. West prepared pictures for the Royal Academy's 1797 exhibition using those procedures, and he also thematized his means of production in pictures shown in that show, including Cicero discovering the Tomb of Archimedes, using the newfound technique to visualize the Roman orator's recovery of knowledge lost under cover of age. What West and other academicians learned from the Provises was a material lesson in absorption. For a first principle of the Provises system stipulated that, quote, the ground on which the picture is to be painted be of an absorbent nature that shall imbibe the oil with which the colors are mixed and caused to adhere to the ground, and shall leave them on the surface in all their purity and beauty. Rendered with a priming vehicle of burnt umber mixed in thick linseed oil spread over repeated layers of Spanish brown, dissolved in animal glue size, those specially prepared grounds registered in contemporary, and it has to be said largely hostile, press coverage of the Academy's 1797 exhibition. One critic there lamented the painter's limited knowledge as to the chemical effect that one body of color will precisely and unalterably have upon another. Worse, the Provises were quickly revealed as operators of a confidence game, one dramatized in merciless satirical detail by James Gillray in November 1797. Here, rather than being the triumphant culmination of the great work, the crowing phoenix spreads its aquiline wings at the apex of Gillray's etched and aqua-tinted design, elevating the mythical manuscript of Venetian recipes above a black obelisk of stretched canvas. With white paint, the diminutive Aunt Jemima Provis traces contours of Titian's exaggerated mustache onto that support's darkened ground. Stars fall, flatulent jets spray from the buttocks of headless beauty. West flees the scene at right as a then-dead Reynolds, who, according to his Victorian biographers, believed in the Venetian secret as ever an alchemist did in the Philosopher's Stone, casts away the flagstones to rise from his grave at lower left. Unlike the absent Christ risen from the rolled rock of West's lithograph, this chemical spirit brings Reynolds up from the dark ground with glasses, ear trumpet, and other frailties of his physical being clearly intact. Yet even as they pursued this recherché chemical cult of what painter James Barry derisively labeled McGilfs and mysteries as risky means necessary to high art, Reynolds, West, and their followers also collaborated with entrepreneurs who sold prolonging protection against their hazardous facture. In the 1780s, painter Joseph Booth began a series of bombastic publications, trumpeting what he variously called polyplasiasmos, or polygraphic replication of grand manner oil paintings by, quote, a chemical and mechanical process without any touch or finishing by the hand, unquote. Polygraphic painting offered a species of artistic immortality. It was, in Booth's terms, immune to changing, cracking, peeling, or any of those other inconveniencies which frequently attend first-rate pictures painted in the usual way. It will multiply pictures as to perpetuate the genius, style, and effect of the most celebrated painters to the most distant ages. Now, the worry that painting in the dominant modern medium of oil was doomed to premature decay, that all of the great works of post-Renaissance painting were soon to be lost to time, had become widespread across 18th century Europe. Indeed, mid-century excavations of brilliantly colored paintings at Herculaneum and Pompeii, pictures that had withstood centuries buried beneath volcanic rock, had prompted the Comte de Caylus, Denis Diderot, and others to attempt to recreate ancient encaustic painting techniques as so-called indestructible, chemically infused alternatives to oil. For his part, Joseph Booth was highly secretive about the mechanical and chemical process by which polygraphic painting would achieve such immortalizing facture. Replicating Philippe de Loutherbourg's Winter, as we see here, he appears to have fabricated a kind of printing matrix for stenciling or stamping oil-painted form onto specially prepared canvases. Recent technical analysis by David Saunders and by Anthony Griffith at the British Museum has identified the surprising presence of a thick, porous, pumice-containing layer added to absorb some of the oil in Booth's pictures. I don't know why that's vibrating. It's not an earthquake. What I want to show you here is the scale of these artifacts. If you've been to the Princeton Drawings Room at the British Museum, which is what we see here, these are artifacts that are listed cataloged as prints, but they look to us like works of oil on canvas. I'm going to switch the slide now so we can all stop vomiting. Okay, thank you. Wallpaper-like in its texture, this unusual factor is visible in Booth's rendering of Winter's central figure, the seated gent in an azure coat who gazes cockily out from the picture plane as a servant affixes his ice skates. Guided down by his thickly outlined, gloved index fingers, we can see a yellowy ground reading out beneath and between three sides of his chair leg. Contrary to the logic of the picture's fiction, this ground reads up through what should be an umber shadow. It is as if the doubled fingers of the gent, which are a little hard to read in the glare of my lousy reproduction, call attention to the invisible chemical ground whose underlying absorption would yield the picture's indestructibility. Or, in Booth's terms, original pictures of the most esteemed masters may be by this art preserved forever. Preservation of artistic patrimony was not Booth's only objective. In an age of improvement, Booth likened polygraphic painting to the rise of the cotton mills introduced into Lancashire, that crucible of the British Midlands' emergent industrial revolution, to which Alois Sennefelder had also sought to cater his lithographic technique. Just as the coming of the Lancashire mills has, quote, rather increased the number of hands employed in the manufactures of cotton than diminished them, Booth analogizes, so will the industrial replication of pictures cherish and diffuse a general taste for painting, thereby giving more employment and encouragement to adepts in that imitative art, unquote. In point of fact, Booth may well have taken his technique from the Midlands industrial juggernaut that was Matthew Boulton's Soho manufactory outside of Birmingham. In 1776, Boulton had begun a partnership for the production of mechanical paintings, an example of which we see here, a replication of a picture by none other than Benjamin West. Yet far greater success was achieved by a more prosaic conjunction of chemomechanical replicative ingenuity, also born of the Soho partnership, and I mean James Watt's copying machine. Mythically sprung from a desire to best the double-nibbed pen or bigrapher developed by fellow Lunar Society member Erasmus Darwin, Watt, whose birthday it is today, incidentally, developed what he called a way of copying writing chemically. Patented by Watt in May 1780, the copying press was available in the portable size, which I was able to see and used to a certain extent in his hometown of Greenock, Scotland, this past summer. The device works like this. Readying the ink sold with the device in an allotted proportion of water, the user writes a letter on a piece of well-sized paper. Once the document has dried, the user extracts a moistened sheet from a specially engineered copying paper from a metal damping box positioned below its felt ground, placing the moist sheet on the face of the dried letter. Dry original and moistened replicator are then sandwiched between sheets of oiled pasteboard and gently pressed between the two rollers, then dried under an even weight. When dry, the copy will show the transferred information in reverse, but the special copying paper is so thin that the supplied ink bleeds through it. Text or image, as in this 1783 copy of a design for bridge piers by engineer John Smeaton, now in the collection of the Royal Society in London, becomes comprehensible simply by flipping the replica over and reading the verso. Cranked and pressed, the copying printer would seem to be a mechanical device, but per Watt's proclamation, it was also chemical in several senses. First, Watt sent to London numerous chemical substances that his patent stationer, James Woodmason, was to incorporate into the manufacture of the proprietary copying paper. As reconstructed by modern historians, quote, the copying tissue was impregnated with a solution of containing tannins. When the faintly colored, partially reacted ink on the original document penetrated into the copying tissue, it would react with the tannins and eventually oxidize to form the dark, insoluble ferric precipitate within the fibers of the paper. Watt refers to these paper additives as things like SHG, C+, G+, and other cryptic titles, always specifying to Woodmason how to use what he was sent and not how to make it himself. Second, the ink was of a special preparation designed to change visibly in time. As instructions included with the device specified, the ink would appear at first very pale and brown, but will become black by keeping. The writing and copies done with it will become black in time, unquote. Understood in modern terms, the metallic salts in the ink preparation mixed with the tannins from nut gall would form ferrous tannate and then blacken into enduring visibility when oxidized. But third, the process by which the ink transferred was itself understood in chemical terms. When replicating drawings or letters, the user is instructed to moisten the original image and then and allow the paper to receive it, then to, quote, pass the board very slowly in order to give the water on the paper time to dissolve the gum of the ink. Its rollers turn sufficiently slowly that the action of the water could dissolve gum in an ink designed to darken in time. The copier is thus a chemical means to immortality, or, as an avid user and improver of Watt's device by the name of Thomas Jefferson claimed, let us save by what means we can artifacts and documents of the early United States' history, not by vaults and locks which fence documents from the public eye and use, but by such multiplication of copies as shall place them beyond the reach of accident. To conclude, I want to turn to another user of Watt's device who would think time, chemistry, and their immortalizing interrelations in different terms. In mid-November 1775, James Watt & Co. received a return on a copying press manufactured at foolscap size. That return came from Thomas Wedgwood, noted patron of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, youngest son of pottery industrialist Josiah Wedgwood, who addressed his missive to James Watt Jr. Both sons of Lunar Society elites, these correspondents knew each other from then recent travels in revolutionary Paris. There, Watt Jr. had been an ardent supporter of the Jacobin faction. Politics were also close to Wedgwood's thoughts, writing in 1795, since he was then negotiating a gift for the radical philosopher William Godwin. Against such Sturm und Drang, the exchange that follows might seem especially absurd. Wedgwood complains to Watt that the copying press sent to him was fitted with rollers of brass, quote, which you recollect informing me were worse and more expensive. Instead, Watt is instructed to dispatch a copier with iron rollers to Wedgwood's address, number 12 Greek Street, Soho, in London. A week later, Wedgwood writes to Watt again. He had received the replacement copier, but not at the desired foolscap paper size. A third machine is then dispatched, and a final letter complicates this comedy of logistical errors still further, as Wedgwood acknowledges that he himself was the source of all of the confusion. Quote, the fact was that I was only looked at the box without taking out the machine, and therefore did not discover the error in the size. Now, if he is remembered at all among historians of art, Tom Wedgwood is likely recalled for the photogenic leaf attributed to him by photohistorian Larry Schaff in what was anticipated to be a multi-million-dollar auction at Sotheby's in the spring of 2008. Although the leaf was mysteriously pulled before the sale transpired, and Schaff has since retracted his attribution, Wedgwood's place in the so-called prehistory of photography has long been sanctioned by none other than William Henry Fox Talbot. In The Pencil of Nature, Talbot had identified Wedgwood and collaborating chemist Humphrey Davy as, quote, the first inventors of the photographic art. That status had been established by an article entitled an account of a method of copying paintings upon glass and of making profiles by the agency of light upon nitrate of silver, which Wedgwood and Davy had published in the Journal of the Royal Institution of Great Britain in 1802. Writing in 1844, Talbot cast his precursors as frustrated in aims that his own calotype process had then putatively achieved. For where Talbot could place a vegetal specimen, as we see on the right, a vegetal specimen on paper soaked in a solution of table salt, brushed with silver nitrate to darken on contact with sunlight, then desensitize with a sodium hyposulfide fixative, Wedgwood and Davy, quote, found it impossible to fix or preserve those pictures, all their numerous attempts to do so having failed. Sanctioned by Talbot, the impulse to excavate material evidence, plotting Wedgwood into the fossil record of photography, to cast his work as missing links, extending photography back at least 3 decades before the Daguerre, Talbot, Annus Mirabilis of photography of 1839, was hardly new to Schaff and Sotheby's in 2008. As but 3 examples of so-called earliest photographs previously associated with Tom Wedgwood, I show you, first, an aforementioned sun picture attributed to Watt, Bolton, and their collaborations with the Wedgwoods, which was exhibited at the Photographic Society of London in 1863, and then dated to the 1790s, identified as a photograph, the first photograph. Second, an engraving after a photograph, so-called, of a breakfast table scene attributed to Tom Wedgwood in 1865 by historian Eliza Mediard. And finally, Henry Adelard's aquatinta and etching of what Mediard in 1871 called the earliest known heliotype or sun picture taken by the inventor of photography, Thomas Wedgwood, in 1791 to 1793. However, building upon the chemical tradition made central to British picture making since Reynolds, what would happen if we were to release Tom Wedgwood's expanded research on light, time, and chemistry from the force field of photography altogether? My proposition is that Wedgwood's work, in fact, suggests a way to invert the standard question. Rather than searching for ways in which his enterprise does or doesn't anticipate photographic techniques, it allows us to apprehend photography, itself a historical compound of competing chemomechanical processes, as but one family cluster in an older, wider web of thinking with chemical materials known to and valued for changing visibly in time. Let me sketch that story in conclusion. In an undated note, in an undated vibrating note, Wedgwood recalls a dream in and about printing. Quote, dreamt of looking at a print, wakened half open my eyes, perceived the image of the print. Without being sensible of any changes in my state of mind or body, the objects of the picture began to extend their edges, which also became indistinct. In wavering and no longer shaking pencil lines, Wedgwood denotes this oniric episode as successive states in printing technique. At left, first state, the contours of a prominent tree and repoussoir screen of vegetation standard to picturesque landscapes of the 1790s bleed and evaporate under dream's erasure into the second state at right. These dream states are what Wedgwood calls spectra of imagination, affording a strong confirmation of Darwin's theory. Yet contrary to Wedgwood's position as a progenitor of photography, and despite this reference to a theory of afterimages by the father of no less a modern scientist than Charles Darwin, a peculiar sense of belatedness pervades Wedgwood's writings. His papers show him to be obsessed with the Molyneux problem, the visual apprehension of distance, childhood perception, a raft of related questions key to Locke, Berkeley, and other philosophers active at least a half century earlier. Instructively, time is a Schwerpunkt of Wedgwood's writings. In an undated essay on time, he observes how language ascribes names to entities, which are in fact compounds of discrete sensory impressions registered in time. English speakers, for example, use the word honey to identify that sweet, yellow, sticky, granulated syrup detected by discrete sensorial acts. The percipient can compare differing intensities of a named entity that then, by Wedgwood's account, yield consciousness of time. This honey is only half as sweet as the honey I consumed previously, prompting recognition of a now and a not now, a present and a past. But, as Wedgwood notes, by transferring perceptual intensity to conceptions of temporality itself, time has come to be coded linguistically in terms of length, terms proper not to time itself, but to the sensory channels from which our named conceptual objects have been formed. Now, meditations like this significantly simplify thinking about time in the British empirical tradition in which Wedgwood was immersed, to say nothing of the conception of time as an a priori category of human cognition articulated in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, which he might have known through his client Coleridge. And in a letter from 1801 to philosopher and politician James Mackintosh, we see in a rather incredible portrait by Sir Thomas Lawrence here, Wedgwood seems to have been cognizant of these shortcomings. Writing the year before the publication of his celebrated paper with Humphrey Davy, Wedgwood proposes that time undulates in its intensity, but is profoundly misapprehended when parsed into familiar divisions. Quote, "In time, there is no past, present, or future. These terms express qualities, relations of visual perception. To speak of past time is just as correct as to speak of colored time or sound." So where he previously allowed the transfer of quantitative values like length onto time to be a harmless tick of linguistic convenience, Wedgwood now casts such rendering as a dangerous capitulation to vision. Phrases like past or future time are, quote, "figurative terms drawn from the affectations of sight. Time never has or will be, but always is, and all its variations are analogous to those of a continual sound, which is sometimes swelling, sometimes fainter, sometimes unvarying, at one time more or another time less, and sometimes uniform." In an immediate disavowal of his own anti-visualizing principles, however, Wedgwood then offers a striking figuration, which I show you here. Time, he claims, has no parts. It is a comprehensive nidus containing all other perceptions. To conceive this, suppose by way of illustration, every visual perception was contained in a given and constant figure like this. Wedgwood then depicts his nidus in three successive iterations. Encapsulated, seen in cross-section, each nest contains a discrete iconism, a tree, a leaf, perhaps a church, encapsulated into a cup of time, before ceding back to linguistic symbolization, also repeated, ampersand C, etc., etc. Quote, "Sometimes the cup of time or nidus would be more attended, its perception would be more intense than others, but if we were always seeing, we would, like time, always be." Nidus, a hive for bees, a cradle for a child, a nest, a drinking cup. And standard to Aristotelian theory of parturition for a woman's role as bearer of fertilized egg, the nidus of time is, in a word, a bed or a ground. Womb, nest, bed. It is hard not to see Wedgwood's organizing temporal motif outside of the shadow of the pots and the cups made so ruthlessly at Josiah Wedgwood's Etruria. Indeed, it is against the factory's incessant division of time into hours, its emphasis on future production, that Tom Wedgwood rails in his papers, vowing to, quote, "avoid all wavering and superficial examination of future urgencies and conduct, give myself to the present moment, O grand, inestimable secret of human happiness." 3 exclamation points. More compelling still is his obsession with visualizing his temporal ideas, even when they are framed as explicitly anti-visual. In draft notes, apparently as revisions for this essay on time, Wedgwood writes, quote, "What is fixed cannot represent the variable. We say that time moves, flows, creeps, passes, etc. These expressions represent moving objects concomitant of time, which are the language of time, but give no idea of time." What Wedgwood seems to want, I want to suggest to you, is a non-linguistic means capable of exemplifying, that is, possessing and highlighting the undulating intensity that is time in his sense, but without reducing it to quantitative terms. And in practical and conceptual dialogue with the chemically engineered grounds designed in the 1790s to achieve pictorial immortality, Wedgwood needs a special nest, a cup or bed, receptively mobilized to absorb time chemically, or at least to attack or undermine our pernicious ideas of it. In this mood, consider the opening lines of Wedgwood's famous 1802 article with Humphrey Davy. Quote, "White paper or leather moistened with a solution of nitrate of silver undergoes no change when kept in a dark place, but being exposed to the light of day, it speedily changes color, and after passing through different shades of gray and brown, becomes at length black. The alteration of color takes place more speedily as the light is intense. In the direct beams of the sun, 2 or 3 minutes are sufficient to produce the full effect. In the shade, several hours are required." Now, it is true that Wedgwood and Davy do go on to specify how, from these principles, it would be possible to copy the images formed by means of a camera obscura, although that aim was hindered for want of a viable fixative. Yet the evidence of Wedgwood's time ratings, coupled with his repeated desire to visualize philosophical ideas, also opens a different avenue. What he makes, we might say, is a chemically prepared bed of leather or paper, fitted to receive time not in illusory quantitative extension, but as a swelling qualitative undulation wherein perceivable images overflow the cup's limits and spill out of attentive range as the support blackens into invisibility. A figural depiction that fades from an unfixed support to visualize time's undulating ontology. Such would be a successful achievement of Wedgwood's project and not its failure, as a patriarch like Talbot would subsequently claim. By extension, this way of cutting the deck would give us not a Whiggish teleology of photography's vertical ascent. Indeed, photography as such, to say nothing of its so-called ontological differences from painting so beloved by recent photo theory, would be beside the point. Instead, just as recent history of alchemy has taught us to recapture the intellectual and aesthetic drives propelling the horrific arts, rather than to bemoan their failures to behave like enlightened sciences, so might we see a horizontal cross-section of competing polymorphous strategies in the nested, entangled bank of temporally evolving chemical objects operative in the 1790s. Thank you. Yeah.
Matthew, thanks for a terrific talk. What I was thinking about is, David's show begins with manuscripts and ends with the LCD screen. And I was wondering whether your talk isn't about, to some degree, the birth of the image, or an image separable from a physical object. And because in some senses, if you take Wedgwood, because an image to some degree exists out of time, in the sense that it can be produced or reproduced at any moment and in a variety of media, and whether that, you think that, is that just an anachronism, or is that actually connected to late 18th and early 19th century thinking?
Thanks, Andrew. I think the turn of phrase, my catchphrase for the book project from which this is a part is that this is a story about temporally evolving chemical objects, and it's not a story about images. And I think that's part of where I'm going with that, in part, is an intervention into the kind of acceleration of the image story told by Benjamin, for example, where what's significant is the capacity of a lithographic mode of visualization to keep pace with an accelerating pace of modern life, which is anticipating and will then be usurped by photographic and then cinematic technologies. And it seems to me that those kinds of teleologies are very attractive for various reasons, but as part of the thrust of the inclusion of an artifact like the copying press, the materiality, the heft of the inks, the existence of a Reynolds painting, both as image that iconographically performs the alchemical transmutation of past sources into new, enduring, valuable gold, but equally enacts those in the material existence of the painting as object, which sees that change through time not as site of loss, of ruin, but as potential for gain in value. I think that that intersection or combination of iconographic image existence and material support existence is super interesting. And one of the prompts, one of the reflections of this sort of backstory of this material has been encountering the story told by Michael Fried, for example, in Absorption and Theatricality, about the new demand in reaction to the Rococo with Diderot, Caillou, this cast of characters, of a new demand on temporality and dilation of the pictorial instant down to a smaller and smaller modicum of time. But exactly those characters at the same time are also concerned with securing against the potential for loss of oil painting's heritage, a technical means through encaustic and other techniques that will make pictorial supports physically indestructible. How do we understand those two demands for pictorial instantaneity and material indestructibility? It seems to me that that's an interesting problem, and it's one that and I'm not saying a dematerialization story is what you're after, but insistence on that dynamic between image and object is, I think, at the core of what is, that's a central tension that I'm interested in with this material.
Very good comment. Could it be explained partially by the collective? Could it be explained by, partially at least, by the rising collective schizophrenia induced by the Industrial Revolution's early signs? And is that why
Yeah, I mean, certainly, yeah.
Because production threatens the old paradigm. At the same time, there's an insistence to preserve what we perceive cultural achievements.
Sure. I mean, you know, part of the story that I'm interested in telling is thinking about Reynolds not simply as a figure of authoritarian or establishment stability, but to attend closely to the ways in which he is seen while embracing and endorsing and depicting and casting members of Britain's ruling elite as, and in the terms of ancient gods and goddesses and their postures and so on and so forth. He's also manufacturing images that are understood by his contemporaries to be radically unstable as chemical artifacts. This is something that is talked about. It's been well known to a conservation literature, which has written fascinatingly on this topic. And it's also robustly there in the period comment on Reynolds. And I think that seeing the class context is absolutely. It's certainly a component of this. And seeing how it ramifies through a tradition of those major players in what we call classical industrial revolution. Absolutely. Yeah.